Honkai Star isn't a particularly complicated game. It has a relatively low skill floor but a reasonably decent skill ceiling. That is to say that while most things will be self-explanatory as you play the game, there are certain mechanics or gameplay elements that may not be too obvious. So if you're new to the game, and especially for those of you who are coming from PlayStation, here are 5 noob traps that you should avoid doing in Honkai Star Rail. Before we run down this list though, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Let me first preface this video by saying that these are mostly targeted at newer players. Some of these tips are pretty basic for veterans of the game, but something newer players may not be immediately aware of. Also, there's no particular order here. Now the first tip is related to relics, which are essentially your character's equipments. When you first start playing, you won't really have access to the dungeons that you can farm relics in, and just get a piece here and there after missions. When you finally open up these dungeons, you may have the urge to use your Trailblazer power, which is the energy system in Star Rail, to start churning out relics for your team. You should probably hold off on doing this. Firstly, at earlier levels, the relics aren't too important for your characters as the content isn't too challenging, so using whatever you get for free will be more than sufficient for a while. Aside from that, each relic dungeon has about 5 levels of difficulty, and only when you reach level 4 and 5 do you want to start grinding these dungeons, because then they start dropping yellow tier relics, which are the highest grade. This also kind of applies to most other dungeons as well, like those for EXP material and character ascension materials. Now, I'm not saying you can't do them at all. If there is a piece you need or you require some EXP books to level up your character, then by all means do so. Just don't spend too much of your time and resources, especially your fuel, when you are early into the game, as you will replace those lower grade relics pretty fast. Personally, I would focus more on EXP books and talent ascension materials first and only min-max your relics later into the game. Speaking of leveling materials, let's talk about leveling your characters. When you first enter the game, your roster is going to be pretty empty. As you start summoning, you're going to start getting a bunch of new characters really quick. We also often get free characters in events and even throughout the story. Because of this, you might feel a bit overwhelmed on which character to focus on, and because each one of them is new and exciting, you will feel the urge to invest in all of them. Don't do this. Being a new player, your resources will be very limited, and spreading them out too thinly will only cause your progress to suffer later on. At a certain point, the free resources you get will stop, and when that happens, you can only replenish them through farming in calyxes or dungeons. This means that once you are out of resources, your progression is gated by the energy you get daily. So the second tip is to focus on building one functional team first, and not a bunch of random characters. Get one damage dealer, a support or sub DPS, a healer, and a tank, and build that team first. Once you have a functioning team, only then should you explore building up other characters. Investing in too many characters too early ensures that none of them will be strong enough when you reach that inevitable wall of difficulty. Moving on to the next tip. Honkai Star Rail is a turn-based game, and the objective, more often than not, is to do as much damage to the enemies in order to defeat them. While this might push you towards focusing purely on damage alone, you really shouldn't ignore the break mechanic present in the game. Essentially, the way it works is that each enemy has a toughness bar, which is this white bar underneath their HP. If you attack these enemies using the elements they are weak to, this bar decreases, and when it reaches 0, the enemy's turn gets delayed as well as taking some bonus damage. On top of that, depending on your element, an additional effect gets applied. The ice element, for example, freezes enemies, while fire applies a damage over time effect on those enemies. This mechanic is crucial as it allows your team to get in more turns and even delay the enemy from using their break hitting attacks. You can just focus on damage if you want to, but capitalizing on breaks keeps your team safe and allows you to dish out attacks more often. What often confuses most people is that on artifacts, you might get a stat called break effect. This break effect doesn't actually speed up how fast you deplete the toughness bar, but instead just increases the bonus damage you cause when your character breaks an enemy. For now, in order to make use of the break mechanic, just ensure you have the right elements for a fight. Okay, now for tip number 4. As I mentioned earlier, there are quite a few characters in the game already, 33 to be exact. As a new player, you might not know which characters are good and worth building. So where does one go to figure out which characters are the best and which should you skip? The answer is most often tier lists. But based on the title of this video, why would I be implying that tier lists are noob traps? Well, the thing is, most tier lists you might find about Star Rail are actually more focused on Mirrors of Chaos viability. The MOC is basically the Spiral Abyss from Genshin if you're familiar with that, or you can think of it as endgame content. The MOC has very specific requirements when it comes to team building, so the tier list you encounter may not be accurate across all content. Let me give you an example. If you look at the Pridewind community tier list, they value Herta and Himeko pretty low because they likely don't perform as well in MOC compared to someone like Imbibitor Lune. However, both those characters are pretty good for Calyx farming, so just looking at tier list alone may give you a false impression on how good a character is. I'm not saying tier lists don't have any value, but early on, you might want to think a bit more broadly instead of following the recommendations of a tier list to the letter, unless you really want to focus on MOC. It really depends on what type of content you are doing. Plus, don't let something like a tier list prevent you from building a character you might like to play. Most of them are viable with enough investment. Now, the last tip is related to the Battle Pass. Much like Genshin Impact, the paid Battle Pass in Star Rail comes with a 4-star weapon or light cone. When you first start the game, you may think this is a good investment, especially if you want to spend some money. But as far as light cones go, there are actually plenty of alternatives available to you. In the simulated universe, a game mode you unlock later, there's Herta's store where you basically get access to some pretty good free 5-star light cones. You can also get 5-star light cones from the shop using currency you get from summoning. Aside from that, every so often we get free light cones from events as well, with the most recent being the Silver Wolf light cone, which was actually really good. So what I'm trying to say is that there are plenty of other free-to-play sources of light cones available just by playing the game, and you shouldn't feel pressured to getting the Battle Pass one. Some of the Battle Pass light cones are pretty decent, but you don't absolutely need them. So those are just some tips I like to share with those of you joining the game for the first time. At the end of the day, the game is meant to be enjoyed, so don't let any of these tips prevent you from doing just that. Play the game however you wish. If any veterans are watching this video for whatever reason, share some tips or noob traps you might be aware of that I didn't mention here in the comments below. If you find this video helpful, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.